Hello, my name is James Ker-Lindsay. In this lecture, I'm going to be talking about a subject that's particularly close to my heart, which is the subject of Britain's relationship with Cyprus. By way of a little bit of background, I have a very long personal relationship with the island. My family moved there about 30 years ago. And so it's a place that I've come to know extremely well. And as I've often said, it's probably the country where, not being an English-speaking country, it's probably the easiest place for someone British to live anywhere in the world. That there are incredibly close ties that exist between Britain and Cyprus. And what I'd like to do in this lecture is just briefly explore some of those ties, but really emphasising the historical relationship. How did we end up having such a close affinity with Cyprus, such a close relationship with this small Mediterranean island? And so what I'll do is I'll go through the history of that relationship and then try and talk a little bit about where things stand today and how I see that relationship. One, from a very scholarly perspective, but also maybe from a little bit more of a personal perspective on the issue. So in terms of history, there's actually an interesting side story to this, if you like, a preface to the whole story, which came at the end of the 12th century when Cyprus was actually conquered by Richard the Lionheart. So he was on his way to the Crusades. He landed in Cyprus, realised here was an opportunity to take the island, did so, realised that he didn't really want it. He couldn't control it terribly easily. And so actually then sold it on to the Knights Templar. The Knights Templar realised they couldn't control it, so wanted their money back. And then he sold it on to someone called Guy de Lusignan, who then established what then became 300 years of Frankish Crusader rule on the island. So that was actually, if you like, a very brief, if you like, first contact that existed between, as I say, England rather than Britain, tempted to say Britain there, but England rather than Britain and Cyprus. So for our purposes, the story really begins in 1878 and the Congress of Berlin. So at that point, the Ottoman Empire was really in a period of decline. You know, this was the empire that was often referred to as the sick man of Europe. But the Ottoman Empire was also a British ally, and they were particularly worried about Russian expansionism into their eastern provinces. And so what we'd already seen is that 20 years before, Britain had been involved in the Crimean War precisely because of those concerns about Russian expansionism into the Ottoman Empire's territories. And so what we saw in 1878 was that Britain was ceded the island of Cyprus in return for a promise that it would help defend the Ottoman Empire in the event of Russian attacks on its eastern provinces. Now, this was significant for Britain for several reasons. Remembering, of course, that at that point, for the British Empire, the absolute jewel in the crown was, of course, India. Now, for a very long time, for Britain to have contact with India essentially meant having to sail around all of Africa. But what we saw at the end of the 19th century was the creation of the Suez Canal. And this promised to radically shorten time for ships to get from Britain to India and vice versa. And of course, this ran through the Mediterranean, so ships would come down through Spain, cross the Mediterranean, and then cross into the Suez Canal, and then out into the Red Sea, and then over to India. And as far as Britain was concerned, Cyprus could potentially fulfill a very important role. Its strategic location at the end of the Eastern Mediterranean meant that it seemed like it could be an ideal base in which to help protect that interest in the Suez Canal. The problem was that Cyprus didn't have deep water port facilities. And so very soon after Britain took control of the island, it actually realised that it didn't have nearly as much value as many in London probably thought that the island was going to have. However, Britain was rather lumbered with Cyprus at that point. And interestingly, it was not ceded Cyprus by the Ottoman Empire. So the Cyprus hadn't become part of the British Empire. It wasn't a British colony. It wasn't under any sort of formal British sovereignty. Instead, Britain had administrative rights over the island. So essentially, we took control of it in order to have this base there, a base that was of no use. The problem was, for many ordinary Cypriots, the bulk of which were Greek-speaking Orthodox Christians, they saw the arrival of Britain as an opportunity to fulfill what they saw as their ambition, their aspiration to join the Greek state. And of course, Britain couldn't fulfill that aspiration. It didn't own Cyprus, it didn't have sovereignty over Cyprus, it was essentially administering it on behalf of the Ottoman Empire in return for these rights. So at the same time as Britain got a territory that it couldn't use for military purpose, it suddenly found itself lumbered with a territory whose majority inhabitants were then starting to agitate for something that Britain couldn't deliver. So all, in many ways you could argue that Cyprus wasn't a great deal for Britain. The next major staging point came during the First World War. And so by this point, Cyprus had effectively been under British control for about 35 years. And what made this so important was that Britain and the Ottoman Empire now found themselves on opposing sides. And this provided the opportunity for Britain to annex Cyprus. So again, it hadn't been a lot of use, but, Britain had control of it. And it saw this as a bargaining chip to try and bring Greece into the war. And so actually London at that point did offer Cyprus to the Greek kingdom. So while the offer was accepted by the Greek Prime Minister, the Greek king was opposed to the deal. He didn't want to take Greece into the war against Germany, partly because he was married to the Kaiser, to the Kaiser's sister. So that offer then lapsed. So at the end of the First World War, the Ottoman Empire ceased to exist. So its claim over Cyprus lapsed. But what we did see instead was the creation of a new Republic of Turkey. But Turkey very early on made it clear that it had no interest in retaining hold of Cyprus. And this was confirmed in 1924 under the Treaty of Lausanne, which then opened the way in 1925 for Britain to formally declare Cyprus to be a colony. And of course, for the Greek Cypriots at that point, as Cyprus was part of the British Empire now, they saw no reason not to push harder for their choice to unite with Greece. And so what we saw is an increase in agitation to that effect. And this spilled over in 1931 when there were really strong anti-colonial riots on the island of Cyprus. And Britain really cracked down against this. So although, as I said, Cyprus didn't have a lot of military value for Britain, it was still, London was absolutely determined that it wasn't going to relinquish the island. It had it in its hand. It was a piece of strategic real estate, if you like, in the Eastern Mediterranean. And so it wanted to keep hold of it. And so it took very, very harsh measures against Cyprus. During the Second World War, though, the Greek Cypriots put on hold their claim for union with Greece and fought very strongly and bravely on the side of the British Empire. And actually Cyprus raised a regiment, the Cyprus Regiment, that fought in North Africa. And so the Cypriots believed that as a result of this step that they saw as goodwill towards the British Empire, that at the end of the war, Britain would reciprocate and then reconsider its position and allow Cyprus to unite with Greece. But of course, that didn't happen. Britain was still determined that it was going to hold on to Cyprus, even though it was in a process, even at that stage, of decolonisation. So of course, in 1947, India became independent, and we were starting to see how other colonial territories were going to become independent. But Britain fiercely resisted this in the case of Cyprus. And it was at this stage that, ironically, that this territory, which had been considered to have so little military value for so very long, now came into its own. Because, of course, in 1956, with the whole Suez Crisis debacle for Britain, Cyprus was actually incredibly important because it became an airbase. And in fact, this is the term that Cyprus has often been known as the unsinkable aircraft carrier. So at a moment that a territory that had been so much trouble for so long, that had had so little value for so long, suddenly starts to come into its own precisely at the moment when Britain is expected to start decolonising. So what we saw at the start of the 1950s is that the Greek Cypriots really pressed their efforts again to unite with Greece. And Britain absolutely steadfastly resisted. It resisted efforts to talk about it. It killed off an attempt to bring the matter before the United Nations. And so on the 1st of April 1955, the Greek Cypriot community launched an uprising against British colonial rule. And again, the intention of this explicitly was to lead to the union of Cyprus with Greece, Enosis, as it's known by its Greek term. The problem was that for the Turkish Cypriot community on the island, they had no interest in being involved in this project. They didn't want to unite with Greece. And instead, what we saw is the emergence, a re-emergence of a Turkish interest in Cyprus. And as the fighting between Greek Cypriots and Britain intensified on the island, we also started to see tensions emerge between the island's Greek and Turkish Cypriot communities. And this really posed the problem of igniting a civil war in Cyprus. And the danger with that was that it could then bring in Greece and Turkey into a conflict. So what we have to remember is that this was taking place at the height of the Cold War, and it was strategically imperative that Greece and Turkey don't go to war. Turkey was an absolutely crucial member of NATO. It was the only non-Arctic route directly into the Soviet Union. So you could talk about all the others, in Eastern, in the countries of NATO that existed elsewhere in Europe, but they all had, if you like, buffer countries between NATO and the Soviet Union, whereas in Turkey's case, and Norway was the other one, obviously, up in Northern Europe, but in Turkey's case, it had direct access into the south of the Soviet Union. So that would have been Georgia and Armenia and Azerbaijan. So it was absolutely crucial for NATO that Greece and Turkey don't go to war, that we didn't see disruption in that very, very important NATO Southeast Europe flank. So in early 1959, Greece and Turkey came up with a compromise solution. Rather than allow Cyprus to unite with Greece, or as the Turkish Cypriots wanted, for the island to be partitioned between Greece and Turkey, they decided that Cyprus would become an independent republic. It would become an independent state. So of course the question is, why did Britain accept this? Well, Britain accepted this because it was offered military bases on the island. London was told, look, you've got a situation here, it's destabilising for NATO, you're involved in a general process of decolonisation anyway, you're going to have to relinquish Cyprus, just like you're relinquishing the other colonial holdings. You might as well do it under these terms, that's something that Greece and Turkey can sign up to, and that you will still be able to retain important military facilities on the island as sovereign territory. So what we saw is that in 1959, Greece, Turkey, Britain all agreed to this plan. All three of them also agreed to become what we call guarantor powers. So they would guarantee the territorial integrity, the sovereignty, the independence of this new Cypriot state, which came into being in August 1960. Now for Britain, it appeared that this would essentially be the end of the story. Cyprus was now independent, it had its bases on the island, all well and good. It didn't work out that way, because what we actually saw is that very soon after Cyprus became independent, tensions started to emerge between the Greek and the Turkish Cypriot communities. Now, under the terms of Cypriot independence, a complex power sharing agreement had been put into place, which effectively ensured that the Turkish Cypriots, even though they were 20% of the population, were well represented in the government. And in many cases, they had 30% of the seats, for example, in the legislature. They had 30% of the posts in the civil service. In the Cyprus Armed Forces, they actually went up to 40%. And in key government decision making, they actually had a power of veto. So you would have a Greek Cypriot president and a Turkish Cypriot vice president, and the Turkish Cypriot vice president would be able to veto certain items of legislation and certain items, executive decisions. So this caused a lot of resentment amongst the majority Greek Cypriots. And by 1963, the tensions were more than apparent. And the Greek Cypriot leader, Archbishop Macarius, put forward some proposals for constitutional amendments. And this led to fighting on the island. And again, Britain found itself right at the eye of the storm. So the first steps that Britain took was actually to institute a peacekeeping force on the island, something called the Joint Truce Force. So this was actually Britain's first ever attempt at peacekeeping. However, it could only be a temporary action because although, from what I've looked at, it went and acted in good faith, it was not acceptable to the majority of Greek Cypriots. They saw Britain as the colonial power and they felt that Britain would naturally have remembered what happened during the Aoki years, that Britain would automatically be more sympathetic, if you like, to the Turkish Cypriots. So very soon after this was established, Britain realised it needed to find another alternative. And the first option it looked at was creating some sort of NATO-based peacekeeping force. But this was something that the Greek Cypriots rejected. They believed that NATO would always favour Turkey over Greece and Turkey over the Greek Cypriots because Turkey's strategic value. So the Greek Cypriot leader Macarius rejected this idea and wrote to the Soviet Union to bring them into the conflict. And the Soviet Union duly obliged. They saw the opportunity to create a bit of mischief in NATO's southeastern flank. And the matter was passed to the UN Security Council, where in early March 1964, it was decided that a UN peacekeeping force would be established on Cyprus, UNFICYP. Interestingly, up until this point, as I've noted, Britain hadn't been involved in UN peacekeeping, but it actually did become a key component in this new UN force in Cyprus. And part of that was, of course, because of the British military bases on the island, which meant that it could help supply and offer services to that new UN peacekeeping force. So Britain, from the very start of the creation of the UN peacekeeping force, and despite the baggage that Britain brought with it because of the colonial period, Britain was very central to the UN mission in Cyprus, and even to this day, it's very central. And by convention, the Chief of Staff, so effectively the number 2 of the force, is always a British officer. So you have a head of a force who comes from all sorts of countries, very often actually from countries that don't actually contribute troops to the mission itself. But Britain is still a major contributor to that UN mission. So since then, in the almost 50 years since then, Britain has remained very active in Cyprus. And there's a couple of moments that I think are really important to bring out. The first of these was 1974. So while Cyprus had become an independent state, there were still many Greek Cypriots who hankered over the idea of union with Greece. And this really spilled over in July 1974 when the Greek military junta ordered the overthrow of Archbishop Macarius in anticipation then for Cyprus uniting with Greece. However, for Turkey, this was absolutely unacceptable. So Turkey immediately sort of contacted Britain and said, right, we have to stop this. Are you going to take action with us? And Britain declined. So Turkey at this stage, calling on its rights as a guarantor power under the terms of the Treaty of Guarantee, launched a military invasion of Cyprus. Now, officially, this should have been done to restore the status quo ante. That didn't actually happen. So Turkey launched a military invasion of Cyprus. And this actually saw Britain put in a very difficult position because on the one hand, it was very important to maintain close working relationships with Turkey as a NATO ally. But on the other hand, there was an understanding of the dangers that this posed for stability in the Eastern Mediterranean. That, could this alienate Greece? Could it involve the Soviet Union again? What would Makarios do, even though he'd been overthrown? And interestingly enough, Britain actually helped him to escape from the island. And at that point, Britain also took the decision that it was going to fulfill its role as a peacekeeper. And so while many Greek Cypriots argue that Britain didn't do what it should have done to stop Turkey from invading, there was actually a very, very interesting incident at Nicosia Airport, which had once been RAF Nicosia, that was the main headquarters of the UN force in Cyprus. As Turkey moved in to try and take the airport, because obviously this was going to be a very important piece of territory for Turkey to get to be able to resupply its troops on the island, Britain actually acted to prevent that. And we came very, very close to quite a significant confrontation with Turkish troops, which could have led to conflict. And that was averted, and there's a fantastic account that's been written by somebody called Brigadier Francis Henn, who wrote his memoirs of having served as the Chief of Staff of UNFICYP, and talked about that very, very tense incident that occurred between Britain and Turkey in 1974. Ever since 1974, Britain has continued to have its role in Cyprus. So, for example, in 1983, the Turkish Cypriots unilaterally declared independence. Now, this went completely against international law, and it was actually Britain that worked very hard to secure a UN Security Council resolution, Resolution 541, which declares that declaration of independence is actually illegal, that there's only one state in Cyprus, and that's the Republic of Cyprus. And Britain also acted very, very quickly to try and prevent countries from recognising this new so-called Turkish Republic of Northern Cyprus, TRNC. And so Britain was really at the forefront of those efforts. Since 1983, Britain has continued to play I think, a very important role in trying to encourage international settlement efforts in Cyprus. Now, of course, these are predominantly and primarily led by the United Nations, but Britain, as a permanent member of the Security Council, has always been very supportive of these talks. It's offered assistance wherever possible. And in actual fact, what we saw was that most recently, the most recent effort by the UN to try and reach a political settlement in Cyprus, which culminated in a 10-day conference in the Swiss mountain resort of Crans-Montana. Britain was actually a part of those talks. Now, by virtue of its place as a guarantor of Cypriot independence, along with Greece and Turkey, Britain has a seat at the table for any ultimate Cyprus deal. So it's not involved in the day-to-day talks between the two sides, but it is going to have to sign off, if you like, on any deal that's reached. And here Britain is very clear in its position. So essentially, it said that it will support any deal that two sides can agree on, as long as it's a workable settlement. So it's likely that if they were to come up with something which really was very, very clearly danger of not being viable, not being long-lasting, could lead to new conflict on the island, then it's possible that Britain would potentially step in and say, look, we can't support this. But anything that looks like it's a reasonable, fair settlement that's going to work, Britain has made it very clear that it will support that deal that the two sides could reach. And as part of this, it's also offered to give up part of the bases. So roughly about 50% of the territory of the bases is a standing offer that was put on the table. So it was originally put on the table in 2004 when there was a failed effort to unite the island. And then what we saw is in 2017, that offer was reiterated. So there's an expectation that in the event of a settlement, Britain will relinquish a certain part of its military bases on the island. So what we've seen is this historical relationship that exists between Britain and Cyprus. But where do things stand today? Britain and Cyprus have, I think, what amounts to a complicated relationship. But on balance, it's a relationship that I think is a lot better than many imagine. So, as I've mentioned, the legacy of the AOCA period, the legacy of the anti-colonial struggle is still very strong in Cyprus. And there's a certain amount of pride, if you like, amongst many Greek Cypriots, that here was the British Empire, and although Britain was in the process of decolonising, there were very few places where that process turned violent, and Cyprus was one of them. And there's a sense amongst Greek Cypriots, they fought the British and they beat Britain and they forced Britain out of the island. Now, they didn't get what they wanted, which was union with Greece. But I think today, many people are actually very pleased with the existence of a Republic of Cyprus. Now, that said, there is this sense that Britain has often taken the side of Turkey. And this is really interesting because in actual fact, having looked at the relationship, having looked at the historical archives, in fact, it's rather different. That although Britain has always put an emphasis on its relationship with Turkey and Turkey's incredibly important role in NATO, Britain has always looked out for its own interests, and those interests, the ones that it needs to protect more, is the existence of the bases. And for that, it's far more important to have a good working relationship with the Cypriot government. So there's a certain irony that while many Greek Cypriots believe that Britain has always taken Turkey's side, in actual fact, the historical record shows, for example, in 1974, although Britain didn't go to war with Turkey and was never going to be in a position to stop the Turkish invasion of the island, it did take very robust steps, for example, to prevent Turkey from taking the airbase. In 1983, Britain was also very significant in making sure that when the Turkish Cypriots declared independence, that was declared illegal by the UN Security Council and stopping countries from recognising Turkish Cypriot independence. In the 1990s, Britain was actually also at the forefront of efforts to get Cyprus into the European Union. Now, at the time, many countries in Europe were very, very sceptical about taking in a divided island into the European Union. And Britain, along with Greece, were the two countries that really spoke out in favour of having Cyprus join the European Union. So in all sorts of ways, although there's a tendency to think that relations between Britain and Cyprus are tense and very difficult, and in some ways they are, the idea that Britain's always worked against Cyprus just simply isn't borne out by the facts. And even at an interpersonal level, there's an incredibly close relationship that exists between Britain and Cyprus. Now, of course, many will be aware of the large Cypriot community that lives in Britain, and that we have third, fourth generations of Cypriots living in Britain, who are fully obviously part of British society, but very proud of that Cypriot heritage and proud of those links that exist between Britain and Cyprus. But it also works the other way. So, in my case, my family has lived there for 30 years. And I feel that there is also a British community that exists in Cyprus. Now, in actual fact, in terms of the overall size of that community, arguably it's relative to the overall size of our respective populations. So the population of Cyprus is probably altogether around 1 million people. That although we don't quite know how many Brits live on the island, it's complicated by the fact that there are many British Cypriots who've moved to the island. There may actually be per capita more Brits in Cyprus than Cypriots in Britain. But leaving that aside, we can see how close the relationship is. Cyprus, is an incredibly important and much loved holiday destination for many British. Likewise, many Cypriots will send their children to British universities. So there's an incredible mixing of the two countries, even to this day. And of course, we have all the other elements. So Britain is still involved in the peacekeeping force in Cyprus. So on a regular basis, Britain will be sending out troops to the island. We have the bases still on the island. But also, we've worked quite closely with the Cypriot government on more and more security topics. And remembering Cyprus does sit at the Eastern Mediterranean, that it sits in a very dangerous and highly unstable part of the world. And we've seen that when there's tensions that overflow in the Near East, in the Middle East, that Cyprus can really come into its own. And of course, Cyprus remains a member of the British Commonwealth. So all this means that Britain and Cyprus have a fascinating historical relationship, which has evolved. So from that first tentative steps by Richard Lionheart, but more recently and more significantly, Britain taking control of the island in the 19th century. And that, although Britain resisted the idea of uniting Cyprus and Greece, that when Cyprus became independent in 1960, that Britain has continued to play, I think, on balance, a constructive role on the island. Now, there will be those who disagree, and as I said, many Greek Cypriots do believe that the hand of Britain is behind everything bad that happens on the island. But the reality, as I say, when looking through the historical records, understanding that there have been difficult periods in that relationship, and certainly the legacy of the Ochre period is very heavy. But considered in the round, taking on board everything that has happened, I think that Britain and Cyprus enjoy a very particular and special relationship that isn't always acknowledged, that isn't always appreciated for the depth that it has to it. And as I say, this isn't just about Britain's role in peacekeeping or peacemaking. It isn't about some of the resentment that people might have about the Ochre period or about the British bases on the island. But it's also about those important interpersonal links that exist between the two countries and the foundations that that creates, you know, both in terms of the Cypriot community that still exists in Britain today and about the British community that still exists in Cyprus today.